Did you know that in 1831, Nat Turner held the deadliest slave revolt in history of the United States? Hi, I'm Abiola Goro, and this is 28 Days of Resistance. Now, for the next month, we are going to be highlighting and talking about resistance and or revolutionary moments in history. Often we hear about some slave revolts, but more often than not, there are histories that we don't know behind them. Not only is it important to actually highlight the movement work, but it's important to understand the methodology that these people may have used. So, Nat Turner led in 1831 in August in Southampton, Virginia. Oh, you have mud all over you. Oh, careful. One of the deadliest slave revolts, or the deadliest slave revolt in the United States history. Now, deadliest slave revolt is different, or we talk about largest slave revolt, most successful slave revolt. These are all varying whenever it comes to how we talk about revolutions and major moments of resistance. This was the deadliest. It ended up resulting in 50 white slave owners and their families being killed all throughout Southampton. Starting at around 2 a.m. on August in 1831, Nat Turner and his crew decided to go through, starting with killing their masters. But part of the conversation that is never talked about is the fact that Nat Turner had this ideology, at the very least, given to him in what he calls a vision and in general just a spiritual sense of responsibility multiple years prior. At the age of 12, Nat Turner was forced to begin slave labor, and he changed masters about 3 times before he ended up at the final one. When he ended up at the final master or enslaver or slave owner, because we got to be very careful with the language that we use, he ended up actually liking him. He said, and I quote, that he was a very nice and kind owner. But he knew that regardless, he had to do what he was called to do. At this time period in the Virginia area, it had slaves that had, for enslaved people, that for the most part had probably the highest levels of freedom in relative comparison to enslaved people across the United States. But one thing that ended up being harmful as a result of this was many of the enslaved people were relatively apathetic towards some of the resistance work that was happening. As a matter of fact, on the day of the resistance, the revolution, the revolt, all these things, so I want to keep using this language, that Nat Turner led, he had many enslaved people, including their families, absolutely denied to have any involvement. After all of this happened, one of the biggest things that also is not talked about is the fact that he and his movement ended up resulting in a spark, not only of the resistance movements that came next in the entire side of Virginia and in general on what we may call the southern East Coast, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but he ended up helping spark the abolition movement. John Brown, who is one of the most famous white, as we call them, accomplices in the history of American resistance work, was directly inspired by Nat Turner's work to lead the revolutions that he did, that he attempted to ignite the Civil War, and was very successful at that. So back to Nat Turner. Whenever we look at the ways in which Nat Turner was able to engage and navigate with these different groups of people, he started about 5 years prior beginning to tell people at the plantation, which is the last one he was sent to, that he was going to need their help. He got 5 to 6 trusted people and made sure that they knew he would have more details. In 1828 is whenever he was actually given exactly, as he calls in a spiritual moment, at being somebody who was a preacher and really heavily studied the Bible, what he was led to do. It's often said that during his end of his life, which after about 2 months he was caught by somebody that was a childhood friend, he was able to then, in his last few days at the courthouse, give a very brilliant testimony. And this was documented by a white lawyer who happened to be intrigued in telling Nat Turner's story. Because of this, we know so many details that we would not know about Nat Turner otherwise. So I hope you learned something. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, and hopefully we're not off to too rocky of a start. I'm so concerned about this mud on her face right now because I don't know how it's just on her face. Anyways, I'm Abiola Okoro. And this is day 1 of 28 Days of Resistance. Make sure you follow me, and if you'd like to contribute to this work, the payment information is below. Thanks. Mwah. Stay tuned. Come on, princess. You need to get clean, girl. Ooh.